The crisp October air in the Catskill Mountains should have been refreshing, but all I could feel was the burning shame spreading across my face. The annual leadership retreat at Pine Ridge Lodge was supposed to be about team building and strategic planning. Instead, it had become the stage for my most humiliating professional moment. "Leadership isn't for everyone, Riley," Robert Sterling said with that condescending smile I'd grown to despise over the past 3 years. The entire executive team was gathered around the stone fireplace in the main lodge, nursing their evening drinks after a day of corporate exercises. Some people are just better suited for support roles. The laughter that followed felt like ice water in my veins. Not everyone laughed. I noticed that Linda from operations and Tom from finance looked uncomfortable, but enough did to make my stomach churn. Sterling raised his whiskey glass in a mock toast. "Here's to knowing your place in the hierarchy." I forced myself to maintain eye contact, even as my hands trembled slightly. "I disagree, Robert. I think leadership is about vision and results, not politics." "Politics?" He leaned back in his leather chair, thoroughly enjoying himself. "This isn't politics, Riley. This is reality. You're a fantastic analyst, probably the best we have, but you'll never lead. You don't have what it takes." The words hung in the air like smoke from the fireplace. Around us, the conversations gradually resumed, but I felt frozen in place. 3 years of 60-hour weeks, 3 years of solving problems that saved the company millions, 3 years of watching less qualified people get promoted while I was told to be patient and wait for the right opportunity. That night, I stood on the lodge's wooden balcony, watching the fog roll through the valley below. The October chill bit through my sweater, but I needed the cold air to think clearly. Back in Manhattan, our marketing firm, Creative Dynamics, was struggling. We'd lost 2 major clients in the past quarter, and the competition was eating into our market share. I knew exactly what needed to be done. I'd been preparing a comprehensive restructuring plan for months, but Sterling had dismissed it without even reading it properly. My phone buzzed with a text from my roommate back in Brooklyn. "How's the corporate retreat from hell? Still planning to quit?" I stared at the message for a long time before typing back, not sure anymore. The truth was, I'd been updating my LinkedIn profile for weeks, quietly reaching out to headhunters. But something about tonight felt different. Maybe it was the humiliation, or maybe it was the clarity that comes from having nothing left to lose. But I found myself thinking about my grandmother's words. Sometimes, Riley, the universe has to knock you down before it can lift you up. Back inside the lodge, I could hear Sterling holding court, probably telling another story about his Harvard MBA days. I pulled out my laptop and opened the restructuring plan I'd been refining for months. If he wouldn't listen to me as his subordinate, maybe it was time to find another way to make my voice heard. The lodge's Wi-Fi was spotty, but I managed to send a carefully worded email to the one board member I'd built a relationship with over the years, Patricia Williams, who'd always encouraged my ideas during quarterly presentations. I attached my plan with a simple subject line: urgent, strategic recommendations for Q4 recovery. As I hit send, I felt a strange mixture of terror and relief. Either this would be the end of my career at Creative Dynamics, or it would be the beginning of something entirely different. The next morning brought one of those perfect autumn days that make the Catskills look like a postcard. The maple trees were ablaze with orange and red, and the morning mist clung to the mountains like a soft blanket. But the beauty of the setting couldn't mask the tension that had settled over our group like a storm cloud. I'd barely slept, replaying Sterling's words and second-guessing my decision to email Patricia. During the morning team-building exercise, a ridiculous trust fall activity that felt like corporate theater, I caught Sterling watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Suspicion? Annoyance? It was hard to tell. "Riley, you're up," called Janet, our overly enthusiastic facilitator. Trust falls are all about vulnerability and letting your team support you. I positioned myself in front of Tom from finance, who gave me an encouraging nod. "I've got you," he whispered. As I fell backward, I couldn't help but think how ironic it was trusting someone to catch me when I felt like I was falling professionally with no one to break my fall. The morning session dragged on with more corporate buzzword bingo and team exercises that felt increasingly pointless given the company's actual problems. During lunch, I picked at my sandwich while Sterling dominated the conversation with his usual mix of business school anecdotes and thinly veiled criticisms of our underperforming departments. That's when my phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. Normally, I would have ignored it, but something made me step outside onto the lodge's wraparound porch. Riley? This is Patricia Williams. I got your email. My heart stopped. Patricia Williams was not just any board member. She was the chairwoman, a legendary figure in the marketing world who'd built and sold 3 agencies before joining our board 5 years ago. She rarely called employees directly. Ms. Williams, First, call me Patricia. Second, I want you to know that your analysis is brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Her voice was warm but decisive. I've been watching our numbers for months, and frankly, I've been concerned about our direction. Your restructuring plan addresses every issue I've identified and several I hadn't even considered. I gripped the porch railing, afraid I might be dreaming. Thank you, but I should mention that Mr. Sterling hasn't. Robert hasn't seen this, has he? Patricia's tone shifted slightly. I suspected as much. Riley, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest. Are you prepared to implement this plan? Because if you are, I'm prepared to make some significant changes. The weight of her words hit me like a physical force. Yes, absolutely. I've been thinking about these solutions for months. Good. I'm calling an emergency board meeting for tomorrow afternoon. Can you present your plan to the full board at 3 p.m.? We'll be meeting in the Manhattan office. I looked through the lodge's windows at Sterling, who was gesturing dramatically while telling another story to his captive audience. Patricia, I should tell you there might be some resistance to these ideas from current leadership. Her laugh was sharp and knowing. Riley, let me worry about resistance. You just focus on being ready to lead. Because after reading your plan, I think it's time for some fresh leadership at Creative Dynamics. The call ended, and I stood there for a full minute, staring at my phone. Through the window, I could see Sterling raise his glass in another toast, completely unaware that his world was about to change dramatically. That afternoon's activities passed in a blur. I participated in the strategic planning session, listening to Sterling outline his vision for the next quarter, a vision that I knew was fundamentally flawed and would likely cost us our remaining major clients. Every time he dismissed someone's input or made a snide comment about thinking outside our capabilities, I felt my resolve strengthen. During the evening dinner, Sterling was in particularly fine form, regaling the table with stories about his previous companies and dropping not-so-subtle hints about upcoming organizational changes. I caught Linda's eye across the table. She'd been with the company for 8 years and had seen plenty of good people pushed out by Sterling's ego. You know, Sterling said, cutting into his steak with theatrical precision, the retreat has really clarified some things for me about our team structure. Sometimes you have to make tough decisions about who's executive material and who's support staff. The message was clear, and it was aimed directly at me. But this time, instead of feeling defeated, I felt something different. Calm, confident, ready. You're absolutely right, Robert, I said quietly. Sometimes the toughest decisions are the most necessary ones. He smiled, completely missing the irony in my agreement. As I watched him celebrate what he thought was my resignation to a subordinate role, I couldn't help but think about how much everything was about to change. Friday morning back in Manhattan hit like a cold slap of reality. The familiar chaos of the city, honking taxis, street vendors, the endless stream of people rushing to their next meeting felt different somehow. Maybe it was because I knew that in a few hours everything would change. Our office on the 34th floor of a glass tower in Midtown had always felt like a battlefield, but today it felt more like a stage. Sterling was back in his element, strutting around the open floor plan like he owned the place, which, to be fair, he thought he did. He'd called an all-hands meeting for 10 a.m. to share insights from our productive retreat. I sat in the conference room, watching Sterling present his quarterly projections on the smartboard. The numbers were optimistic to the point of being delusional. He was forecasting 25% growth when we were barely treading water, and his strategy relied on doubling down on the same approaches that had cost us clients in the first place. Questions? Sterling asked, scanning the room with the confidence of someone who didn't actually want any. I raised my hand. Robert, these projections assume we'll retain our current client base, but our satisfaction scores have been declining for 6 months. How do we address that? His smile tightened. Riley, sometimes you have to think bigger picture. Client satisfaction is cyclical. They'll come around when they see our results. But what if they don't? We're hemorrhaging talent to competitors, and our creative output has been. That's enough. Sterling's voice cut through the room like a blade. I think our discussion at the retreat covered your perspective on leadership decisions. The room went silent. I could feel 20 pairs of eyes watching this power play unfold. Linda shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Tom was studying his notepad intently. Even Janet from HR looked like she wanted to disappear. You're right, I said, standing up slowly. We did have an important discussion about leadership. Sterling's triumphant expression suggested he thought I was about to publicly submit to his authority. Instead, I gathered my materials and headed for the door. Where are you going? He called after me. Board meeting, I said without turning around. Patricia Williams requested my presence. The silence that followed was deafening. 2 hours later, I stood outside the boardroom on the 42nd floor, smoothing down my blazer and trying to calm my racing heart. Through the frosted glass, I could see the silhouettes of the 7 board members. Patricia had texted me earlier, just be yourself. They need to hear what you have to say. When I entered, the atmosphere was formal but not unfriendly. Patricia sat at the head of the mahogany table, her silver hair perfectly styled and her expression unreadable. The other board members, a mix of industry veterans and successful entrepreneurs, looked up from their tablets, where they'd clearly been reviewing my proposal. Riley, Patricia said warmly, thank you for joining us. Please take a seat. For the next hour, I presented my restructuring plan with more confidence than I'd ever felt in my professional life. I walked them through the client retention analysis, the competitive landscape assessment, and the detailed implementation timeline. I showed them how we could cut operational costs by 30% while improving service quality and rebuilding our creative reputation. The questions were sharp but fair. Margaret Foster, who'd built 3 successful startups, grilled me on the financial projections. James Mitchell, a former CEO of a major advertising conglomerate, wanted to know about change management and employee retention during transitions. I had answers for everything, not because I was lucky, but because I'd been thinking about these problems every day for months while Sterling was focused on his own image. Impressive work, said Dr. Catherine Ross, our longest-serving board member. This level of strategic thinking is exactly what we need right now. That's when the conference room door opened, and Sterling walked in. I'm sorry I'm late, he said, clearly not sorry at all. My assistant said there was an emergency board meeting, but she must have. He stopped mid-sentence when he saw me sitting at the table with my presentation still displayed on the screen. Robert, Patricia said coolly, perfect timing. We were just discussing Riley's strategic recommendations for the company's future direction. Sterling's face went through a fascinating series of expressions. Confusion, then recognition, then barely controlled rage. I see. And when were you planning to discuss this with me? Seeing as I'm the CEO. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Patricia folded her hands on the table with the precision of someone who'd navigated countless corporate power struggles. Robert, that's actually what we need to discuss. The board meeting that followed was like watching a controlled demolition in slow motion. Sterling tried to maintain his composure, but with each passing minute, it became clear that the board had already made their decision. They presented him with what Patricia diplomatically called a transition package, 6-month severance, and a glowing recommendation letter in exchange for his immediate resignation. "This is ridiculous," Sterling said, his voice rising for the first time since I'd known him. "I've been with this company for 5 years. We've had some challenges, yes, but—" "Robert," interrupted James Mitchell, "we've lost 40% of our client base in the past year. Our employee turnover is at an all-time high, and we're bleeding talent to competitors. The numbers don't lie." I watched this unfold with a mixture of vindication and genuine sympathy. Despite everything Sterling had put me through, seeing someone's career implode was sobering. But then I remembered his words from 2 nights ago, "You'll never lead." The irony wasn't lost on me. After Sterling left taking his box of personal items, and his wounded pride, Patricia, turned to me with an expression that was both maternal and businesslike. "Riley, the board has voted unanimously to offer you the position of interim CEO with a pathway to permanent leadership based on your performance over the next 6 months. Are you interested?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. 6 months ago, I would have stammered out some self-deprecating response about not being ready. But standing there in that boardroom, looking out at the Manhattan skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows, I felt something I'd never experienced before: absolute certainty. "Yes," I said, "I'm ready." The next 6 months transformed not just creative dynamics, but me as a person. The first month was the hardest. Implementing layoffs is never easy, even when they're necessary. But I made sure every decision was transparent and fair. I held town halls, answered tough questions, and admitted when I didn't have all the answers. Linda became my operations director and proved to be exactly the strategic thinker I'd always suspected she was. Tom took over as CFO and helped me restructure our debt in ways that gave us breathing room to rebuild. We hired young, hungry creatives and paired them with industry veterans who understood both innovation and execution. The turnaround wasn't immediate, but it was steady. By month 3, we'd stopped the client bleeding. By month 5, we'd won 2 new accounts that were larger than anything Sterling had brought in during his entire tenure. Our employee satisfaction scores went from bottom quartile to top 10% in our industry. The transformation wasn't just professional, it was personal. I moved from my cramped Brooklyn apartment to a 1-bedroom in Lower Manhattan with actual sunlight and a view of the Hudson River. More importantly, I started believing in my own voice. I joined the board of a nonprofit focused on mentoring young professionals and started speaking at industry conferences about authentic leadership. 6 months to the day after that humiliating evening at Pine Ridge Lodge, I sat in the same boardroom where my life had changed. This time the meeting was a formality. The board was making my CEO position permanent, along with a compensation package that reflected the value I'd brought to the company. "Congratulations, Riley," Patricia said, shaking my hand after we'd signed all the papers. "You've exceeded even my highest expectations." As I walked back to my office, Sterling's former office, which I'd redecorated with plants and natural light instead of his intimidating dark wood and leather, I passed the conference room where I'd endured so many meetings as a silent observer. Now, my team was gathered around the table, energetically debating our next quarter's creative strategy. My assistant knocked on my door. "Riley, there's someone here to see you. Says he's a former colleague." I looked up to see Sterling standing in my doorway. He looked smaller somehow, dressed in a casual button-down instead of his usual power suit. His hair was a bit longer, and there were lines around his eyes I'd never noticed before. "Robert," I said, gesturing to the chair across from my desk. "This is unexpected." He sat down heavily, avoiding eye contact. "I wanted to apologize," he said quietly, "for what I said at the retreat. For a lot of things, actually." I studied his face, looking for any sign of manipulation or hidden agenda. But all I saw was genuine regret and maybe a little bit of fear. I've been doing some consulting work, he continued. Smaller companies, mostly. It's given me time to think about my leadership style and the impact I had on people like you. People like me? People who were better leaders than I ever was. But I was too threatened to see it. He finally met my eyes. You've done incredible work here, Riley. The industry is talking about creative dynamics again, and not because we're failing. We talked for another 20 minutes. It wasn't a friendship rebuilding conversation, but it was human. He told me about his struggles with imposter syndrome, how his aggressive leadership style had been a defense mechanism against his own insecurities. I shared some of the challenges I'd faced in the transition and how I'd learned to lead through empathy rather than intimidation. When he left, I sat in my office as the afternoon sun streamed through the windows, thinking about the strange journey that had brought me here. My phone buzzed with a calendar reminder for the company's holiday party next week, the first one in years, where people were actually excited to attend. That evening, I called my grandmother from the subway platform, waiting for the train that would take me home to my new apartment. Grandma, remember what you told me about the universe knocking you down before lifting you up? Her laugh was warm and knowing. Of course, sweetheart. Did something good happen? I looked around at the controlled chaos of the subway station, people rushing home to their families, street musicians playing for commuters, the endless energy of a city that never stops moving, and smiled. Yeah, Grandma, something really good happened. As the train pulled into the station, I thought about Sterling's words from that night at the lodge. You'll never lead. He'd been wrong about a lot of things, but he'd been especially wrong about that. I hadn't just learned to lead, I'd learned to lead authentically, with empathy and vision rather than fear and ego. The train doors opened, and I stepped inside, ready for whatever challenge tomorrow would bring. Because sometimes the biggest transformation happens not when you change who you are, but when you finally become who you were always meant to be.